At the first light of March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea stretched out under a sky streaked with pale clouds, deceptively serene. The waters lay almost motionless, and the kind of calm that makes a sailor think the ocean itself is holding its breath had settled over the convoy. On the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura surveyed his charges with measured eyes. 8 destroyers flanked 8 fully laden transport ships, carrying the 51st Division's 6,900 soldiers, bound for Lai, at the command of Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. To Kimura, this was far more than a routine escort mission. It was a lifeline, a thread connecting the far-flung reaches of Japan's empire across the vast Pacific. For over a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled these waters with confidence. Convoys slipped along under the protective ring of seasoned destroyers, anti-aircraft crews trained to a razor's edge, and the watchful eye of aircraft based in Rabaul. Close calls had occurred, but disaster had yet to touch them. The men on Kimura's bridge had seen the Americans before, the lumbering B-17s, their bombs often harmlessly plunging into the sea, and torpedo planes, slow and predictable, easy targets for concentrated fire. "They're clumsy," one gunnery officer murmured. "They attack exactly where we expect them to." Kimura nodded without a word, silently agreeing as his convoy sailed in textbook formation. Destroyers forming a protective ring, transports steady and unyielding at the center, every vessel maintaining perfect spacing and speed. It was a choreography of discipline and precision, faith woven into steel and diesel. Below decks, the soldiers mirrored that confidence. Young men from Osaka, Sapporo, and Kyoto, barely 20, full of hope and fear alike, shared the quiet rituals of a long sea voyage. Some hummed songs, others scribbled hurried letters to loved ones. The air carried the scent of diesel and tobacco, mingled with the nervous energy of youth. In the mess, a soldier laughed as he attempted to balance a cup of tea on the swaying table. To them, this journey was merely a pause, a calm corridor before the storm that awaited in the jungled hills of New Guinea. By 0600 hours, the sun had climbed, painting the ocean gold. Kimura adjusted his binoculars, scanning the horizon. 8 transports glided along in perfect alignment, their wakes trailing white ribbons across the water. Destroyers flanked them like vigilant wolves, guardians of the herd. Pride stirred in Kimura's chest at the sight of order, discipline, and purpose. No reason yet suggested that this mission would differ from any of the dozens before. Reports of American reconnaissance aircraft had reached them, but they were vague, unreliable. Japanese doctrine considered such threats manageable. After all, the Americans had demonstrated little ability to halt supply convoys. Time and again, the Navy's iron umbrella had kept the lifelines intact. Yet beneath that serene surface, destiny was stirring. Hundreds of miles to the south, on dusty Australian airstrips, crews were loading bombs into modified B-25 Mitchell bombers machines, unlike anything Kimura's sailors had faced. In a few hours, these bombers would climb into the sky, cross the coastline, and unleash a new kind of warfare, one born not from conference tables, but from the ingenuity of field mechanics and desperate minds. Meanwhile, the Japanese sailors clung to routine. Anti-aircraft gunners polished lenses and loaded magazines. Signalmen scanned the heavens. Officers reviewed formation charts, confident that their training could withstand any threat. The radio on the Shirayuki's bridge crackled with benign updates. Light cloud cover, excellent visibility, no sign of the enemy. Kimura folded his hands behind his back, allowing a small, satisfied smile. The convoy was on schedule. The Imperial Navy had performed this dance many times before. What he could not know, what no Japanese officer could imagine, was that a new force of American ingenuity and industrial power was about to rewrite the rules of naval warfare. These bombers were no ordinary aircraft. They carried neither torpedoes nor hesitation, only precision and mechanical fury. By the time Kimura's lookouts glimpsed them on the horizon, it would already be too late. The calm of the Bismarck Sea was about to explode, and within 15 minutes, the convoy that seemed so invincible would become a floating inferno of fire and oil. While Admiral Kimura's flotilla glided confidently through the golden morning, a storm of a different kind was taking shape hundreds of miles south, in the blistering heat of Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane. Tin-roofed hangars, red dust, and the acrid smell of hot oil filled the air. There, far from design bureaus and factories, a restless American officer, Major Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, was preparing to change aerial warfare forever. Gunn was no conventional officer. A Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces mechanic turned problem solver. He had learned a brutal truth in the Pacific War. High-altitude bombing of ships simply didn't work. Bombs missed, torpedoes failed. Pilots died by the dozens attempting to strike moving targets from miles above the waves. Every convoy that slipped through meant more American soldiers falling on New Guinea's beaches, and Gunn was determined to stop it. Imagine standing in a dusty Australian hangar, the morning light filtering through corrugated metal, when an idea so audacious it borders on madness begins to take shape. That was the moment when Gunn, stubborn, relentless, unwilling to accept defeat, made a choice that would transform the air war in the Pacific. High-altitude bombs couldn't touch moving ships? Fine. Then the bombers themselves would become the weapons. Radical? Absolutely. But Gunn was not a man known for half measures. He chose the North American B-25 Mitchell, a rugged twin-engine medium bomber that had never been designed for low-altitude ship attacks. Picture Gunn rolling one into his hangar, stripping the paint off the nose until the metal gleamed raw, then turning to his crew with a cigarette dangling from his lip. Everything inside the bombardier's compartment had to go. The Norden bomb sight, the glass panels, the wiring, every last component that wasn't pure firepower. "We're not aiming from 10,000 feet anymore," he growled, pacing through the dust. "We're aiming down the barrel." His mechanics froze. No blueprints, no manuals, no authorization from command. But Gunn's certainty spread through the workshop like an electrical current. Soon, steel plates were being welded into the nose, the frame reinforced to absorb brutal recoil. Then came the guns. First two Browning .50 caliber machine guns capable of 850 rounds per minute. 2 became 4. 4 became 6. By the end, 8 long barrels jutted from the B-25's nose like the fangs of some metallic predator waiting to pounce. Each gun demanded its own ammunition feed, each its own charging mechanism. Mechanics scavenged belts from wrecked aircraft, redesigned feed chutes, and built ammunition boxes, 400 rounds per gun. Wires were rerouted through the cockpit, so a pilot could unleash all 8 guns with a single squeeze of the trigger. But the cost of this firepower was weight, more than 500 pounds of steel and ammunition, dragging the aircraft's balance forward. Gunn himself recalculated the trim, adjusting counterweights and fuel distribution until the bomber flew level again. When he finally stepped back, the machine before him no longer resembled a precision bomber. It looked and felt like an airborne chainsaw. Dawn marked the test flight. The modified B-25 taxed onto the red dirt runway, engines coughing thick black smoke into the crisp air. Gunn climbed into the cockpit wearing grease-stained coveralls rather than a flight suit, as if daring the plane to object. As the aircraft lifted away from the earth, ground crew instinctively covered their ears. At 500 feet over the practice range, Gunn leveled off and pressed the trigger. The nose erupted. Blinding flashes, a rolling roar, 8 converging streams of fire. The airframe shuddered violently, the recoil sending vibrations down the fuselage like a pulse from some living beast. Spent shells spewed from the sides, ringing against the wings in a glittering rain of brass. When he landed, the grin on his face said everything before he even spoke. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he declared. "She eats ships." Word tore through the 5th Air Force like wildfire. Pilots who witnessed the demonstration stood speechless. One compared the aircraft to a destroyer turned sideways and fitted with wings. Another shook his head and muttered, "That's not a bomber, it's a buzzsaw." Within weeks, field modification crews across Australia were replicating Gunn's design, welding reinforcement plates, expanding ammunition storage, standardizing electrical firing circuits. A new creature had been born, a medium bomber reinvented as a gunship. And its firepower? Staggering. 8 50 caliber machine guns firing at once produced 6,800 rounds per minute. Each bullet weighed nearly an ounce and flew at 2,910 feet per second, swift enough to tear through armor plating. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary rounds burst into 3,000-degree Fahrenheit fire on impact. A 2-second burst from a converted B-25 could shred the superstructure of a destroyer, obliterate anti-aircraft guns, and rip apart exposed crews before they could even respond. Pilots gave the aircraft a new name, the Strafer. To put its power into perspective, remember that most Japanese destroyers carried no more than 6 25mm deck guns. A single Strafer could pour more forward-facing fire into the enemy than an entire escort ship. At close range, those guns didn't merely damage steel, they carved it apart. One American mechanic captured the experience perfectly during early tests. It wasn't gunfire anymore, it was a mechanical scream. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, traveled to Eagle Farm to witness the invention himself. After the demonstration, he turned to his aide and remarked, "We'll make 100 of these if we can. They'll tear Japan's lifeline to pieces." At last, Gunn's improvisation won official approval. North American Aviation began integrating the 8-gun nose into new production models. But the first battles would belong to the field-modified conversions, the aircraft flown by the newly formed 3rd Attack Group, soon known as the Grim Reapers. By early 1943, Gunn's Strafer bombers were ready for war. Their aluminum skins bore hand-painted names: Ruthless, Dirty Dora, Hell's Angel. But more than paint, they carried a philosophy. Fly low, fly fast, strike without hesitation. Pilots trained to skim just above treetops and surf wave crests, to attack along the horizon, to get close enough to see the whites of their eyes. This wasn't swagger, it was survival. One slip meant instant death, but success meant annihilating the enemy before he even raised his guns. And so, a single man's improvised experiment was about to unleash mechanical terror across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had no clue that its trusted convoy routes were about to transform into slaughter zones. As these flying monsters rolled out of the Australian workshops, a second innovation was forming just a few hundred miles away. Not more guns, not better engines, but a bold reinvention of the oldest aerial weapon: the bomb. The mind behind it was Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group, a quiet, methodical officer who had grown weary of watching high-altitude bombing runs miss every moving ship they targeted. The Pacific was too vast, the weather too unpredictable, and Japanese captains too skilled at slipping away. Then came Ben's idea, one that sounded almost absurd, when he first voiced it, in a briefing at Port Moresby. "What if," he said slowly, "we make the bomb skip?" The inspiration came from watching children skim flat stones across a river. Ben realized that, at just the right height and speed, a bomb could do the same. Bounce once or twice across the water's surface, and then slam into a ship's hull at the waterline. The plan was deceptively simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. The bombers would have to fly straight and level at no more than 200 feet, sometimes even lower. At that altitude, a single burst of anti-aircraft fire could tear a plane apart. The timing of each bomb release had to be perfect, half a second too early, and the bomb would skip harmlessly across the water. Half a second too late, and it could ricochet back into the aircraft. To test the idea, Ben's crews turned to a rusted, half-submerged cargo ship stranded on a reef near Port Moresby, the SS Pruth. Its corroded hull jutted from turquoise shallows, a perfect stand-in for a Japanese transport. Day after day, pilots of the 43rd Bombardment Group practiced attack runs. They flew so low their propellers churned white spray into the sea. Navigators counted down to release, while bombardiers, retrained as spotters, shouted urgent corrections over the intercom. The early attempts were catastrophic. Bombs skipped unpredictably, detonated too soon, or missed entirely. But gradually, the men learned the rhythm. The glide, the release, the lift of the nose just before the explosion. One pilot likened it to throwing a rock so hard that the sea itself leaped to meet it. Another said he could feel the air compress against the surface as he raced his own bomb. Ben meticulously recorded every run, adjusting for speed, angle, and altitude. He discovered that 250 feet of altitude, 220 miles per hour, and a release distance of roughly 600 yards gave the most consistent results. Equipped with 500-pound demolition bombs fitted with 4 or 5-second delay fuses, the weapon would pierce a ship's hull before detonating inside. The crews who mastered skip bombing knew exactly how thin the line between life and death was. Flying at mast height meant they could see the faces of men on deck. A single hit from a 25mm gun could shred an engine or kill a pilot. Every training run felt like combat. Every mistake scattered wreckage across the reef. And yet, the results were undeniable. After weeks of relentless practice, the 43rd Bombardment Group could strike a stationary ship 9 times out of 10. Moving targets were harder, but no longer impossible. In January 1943, Ben's commanding officer invited General George Kenny to witness a live demonstration. As the B-25 dipped low over the water, Kenny watched its reflection skimming the surface just below the fuselage. At precisely 600 yards, the bomb dropped, skipped once, and struck the Pruth. A moment later, the hull erupted in a geyser of flame and seawater. Kenny stared for a long moment, then turned to Ben. "That," he said, "is how we're going to end Japan's shipping." The 5th Air Force began combining skip bombers with strafing aircraft. The plan was ruthless in its elegance. First, the Strafers would sweep in, their 50 caliber guns silencing anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, their explosions so close that they could lift ships out of the water. Japanese defenses, designed to counter high-altitude or torpedo attacks, were helpless against this new 2-stage assault. The crews trained with obsessive intensity. They flew tight formations at just 50 feet, approaching from the sun or the wind, synchronizing gunfire and bomb release so precisely that the entire attack could unfold in under a minute. At dawn and dusk, the airstrips at Port Moresby thundered with engines, horizons blurring from the roar of practice runs. Mechanics painted shark mouths and nicknames on the noses of the aircraft. Ruthless, Hellion, Barbie III. Each plane was more than steel. It was a promise that the next convoy sailing under the rising sun would meet annihilation. By late February 1943, intelligence confirmed what they had been waiting for. A Japanese Convoy 8 transports and 8 destroyers was heading toward Lai to reinforce New Guinea. To the Japanese, it was routine. To the Americans and Australians, it was the perfect test of the secret weapons they had forged in sweat, fire, and ingenuity. At Eagle Farm and Port Moresby, armorers checked fuses and loaded ammunition belts. Pilots studied maps of the Bismarck Sea, tracing attack routes with grease pencils. The air reeked of gasoline and damp earth. Men slept beside their planes, fearing the moment the call would come. For most, it would be their first low-level combat. For some, it would be their last. They understood what was at stake. Success could cripple Japan's ability to move troops across the Pacific. Failure meant thousands of Japanese soldiers landing safely at Lai, and the brutal New Guinea campaign continuing. In the early hours of March 3rd, Ben's crews climbed into their B-25s, strapped in, tightened harnesses, and waited for engines to roar. The sun had yet to rise. A faint drizzle swept across the field. Someone shouted a prayer. Propellers spun, kicking dust into the air. The smell of fuel mingled with sweat. One by one, the bombers lifted into darkness, navigation lights blinking over the jungle canopy. Far to the north, the convoy sailed unknowingly toward disaster. The Japanese officers on watch would soon see tiny black dots skimming the waves like seabirds, the first harbingers that the rules of naval warfare were about to change forever. At precisely 10:20 a.m., lookouts aboard Admiral Kimura's flagship, Shirayuki, glimpsed silver flashes on the horizon. They shaded their eyes against the morning glare and pointed upward. A formation of American B-17Es approached at roughly 7,000 feet. Kimura lowered his binoculars, calm as ever. High-altitude bombers had harassed convoys before with little success. Bombs had splashed harmlessly into the sea. "Maintain course," he ordered. Anti-aircraft crews prepared, shouting range and bearing. Guns elevated, belts loaded, sights adjusted. Black bursts of flak blossomed into the sky. The 25mm cannons thundered like distant drums. But the Japanese gunners could not see what was coming. Barely 15 miles away, 12 B-25 Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group and 13 Royal Australian Air Force Buffalo fighters skimmed the waves. Their propellers churned mist into the air. Sunlight flashed off aluminum fuselages, each nose bristling with 8 machine guns. Major Edward Edliner, commanding the 90th Bombardment Squadron, led the first attack. His aircraft, ruthless, roared at 280 miles per hour toward the Shirayuki. From the bridge, sailors glimpsed something glinting on the horizon. At first, they thought it reconnaissance planes. Then a cry rang out. "Techie! Low! Low!" Gunners scrambled, swinging weapons downward, but the planes were already upon them. Ruthless unleashed 850 caliber guns simultaneously. Fire and thunder erupted from the nose, a wall of light tearing through steel and flesh. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the Shirayuki's bridge at nearly 2,900 feet per second. Windows shattered, spraying glass across the command deck. Metal buckled. Men vanished in sparks and smoke. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few survivors, later recalled. It was like being trapped inside a machine shop as every wall caught fire. The air itself screamed. Picture this. Liner held the trigger for a full 8 seconds, nearly 900 rounds tearing from the nose of Ruthless, before releasing 2 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses. The bombs skipped once, twice, and then slammed into the destroyer Shirayuki just below the waterline. The midsection exploded, steam and smoke blasting skyward. the ship listing sharply to port as if the ocean itself were trying to reject it. Behind Ruthless, 11 more B-25s roared in, each finding a new target with deadly precision. Lieutenant John Hennebury, at the controls of the aircraft nicknamed the Hare, let his 8 guns walk from bow to stern of the transport Kaikusai Maru, shredding the bridge and silencing every anti-aircraft position before his bombs even touched the water. The captain never had a chance, the helm destroyed, the crew dead or wounded, the ship helpless under the hail of steel and fire. Not far above, the Buell fighters streaked low, some barely 20 feet over the waves. Their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns hammered the upper decks of the transports, cutting down any gunners who dared return fire. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy of No. 30 Squadron, RAAF, later described it. You could see the men on deck, their guns flashing. Then our cannons hit, and it was like watching the deck disintegrate. One moment there were shapes, the next, just smoke and splinters. The convoy erupted into chaos. Ships twisted and weaved in desperate maneuvers, white plumes of foam marking their frantic paths. Tracer fire boiled across the water. Bombs skipped across the waves, slamming into hulls and detonating deep inside. The Taime Maru took a direct hit near the engine room, flames roaring from ventilation shafts. The Nojima Maru was struck by 2 bombs, torn open like a tin can. On the destroyer Arashio, Commander Kiyoshi Sugino tried desperately to shield the transports, steering between the attackers and his charges. Courage, however, made him an even easier target. 3 B-25s turned their guns on him simultaneously, a storm of 24 barrels unleashed at once. The Arashio's bridge erupted in fire and debris, her rudder jammed hard to starboard. Moments later, the out-of-control destroyer collided with Nojima Maru. The 2 vessels locked together in a fiery death embrace, ammunition and fuel igniting in a crescendo of explosions. For the surviving Japanese sailors, it was as if the rules of war had been rewritten. There were no sirens, no warning calls, no evasive maneuvers that worked. The attackers came too fast, too low, and the B-25's guns, 8 barrels hammering in perfect, terrifying unison, produced a roar unlike anything they had ever heard. It was no longer gunfire. It was a mechanical scream that shook the air, filling every nerve with dread. Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the deck of his flagship, staring at the inferno. Ships burned in every direction, black smoke columns rising thousands of feet. His largest transport, Kembu Maru, had taken 2 hits and was sinking stern first. Men leaped into the burning water, uniforms aflame, the calm blue sea now streaked with oil and fire. Leonard's gunner in the rear turret watched in horror, later recalling, "It was like hell had opened on the ocean. Everywhere you looked, something was exploding. And then, just like that, 15 minutes passed." When the last B-25s peeled away, climbing low over the blazing wreckage, 4 Japanese destroyers and all 8 transports were either sinking or aflame. Thousands of soldiers and sailors struggled in the water. From the shoreline of disaster, the echo of the guns lingered, a rumbling thunder rolling away from a storm that had already passed. One officer, waist-deep beside an overturned lifeboat, whispered in disbelief, "We never saw them coming." The sea had become a floating graveyard, calm and bright that morning, now black with fuel and debris, shimmering under the orange glow of flames. The Shirayuki, once the pride of her escort line, was gone. Only a patch of burning oil marked her passing. Arashio lay dead in the water, locked against Nojima Maru, both vessels burning from bow to stern, ammunition cooking off in bursts like fireworks. Men leapt into the inferno, clinging to debris, faces slick with oil, screaming for help that would never arrive. Kimura issued rescue orders, but the surviving destroyers were themselves damaged, aflame, crippled. The Asagumo tried to maneuver closer to save men, only to be met by another wave of low-flying B-25s, returning to strafe the wreckage. Gunfire swept decks clean, cutting down crew as they tried to haul their comrades aboard. Even those already in the water found no mercy. The Americans followed orders to prevent reinforcement from reaching Leh, strafing lifeboats and swimmers alike. For the Japanese, there was nowhere to hide. The air reeked of burning fuel and cordite. The sea boiled with oil and fire. One survivor later described it. The water itself seemed to burn, heat surging from below, sky blood-red above, and no surface left untouched by flames. Below decks on Kaikusei Maru, hundreds of soldiers from the 51st Division had been trapped when the bombs struck. As the ship sank, they clawed toward hatches jammed by twisted metal, jumped from portholes only to be dragged under by the sinking hull. Rifles, helmets, gear, all pulled them down into the fire-choked sea. Discipline dissolved. Rank meant nothing. Men shouted for mothers, for gods, for air, for anything, as the ocean around them became an inferno of metal, flame, and death. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few officers to survive, later wrote, "I heard men calling to each other, but the voices stopped one by one. A hand reached for me from the water, but when I grasped it, it came away at the wrist. I cannot forget the weight of that hand." By 10:30 a.m., less than half an hour after the first bombs fell, the Bismarck Sea had become unrecognizable. Burning ships drifted aimlessly, colliding with each other as flames consumed their wooden decks. Explosions erupted at random, munitions and fuel tanks detonating in a relentless, chaotic rhythm. Shock waves rippled across the oil-streaked water, flipping bodies and lifeboats alike. Smoke pillars climbed so high that American reconnaissance planes could see them from over 50 miles away. Kimura's surviving destroyers, Asashio, Yukikaze, Shikinami, and Uranami, attempted to regroup. They threw ropes and nets over the sides, hauling aboard anyone still alive. The decks were slick with blood and oil. Corpsmen worked without morphine or bandages, tearing their own shirts into strips. The wounded were laid in rows on steel decks, some still clutching letters that had survived the inferno, others whispering prayers to ancestors whose names they could barely remember. In the water, sharks began to gather. At first they fed on debris and fish drawn by the carnage. Then they turned to men. Survivors described the sea erupting around them, fins slicing through the oil, screams cut short as men vanished beneath the waves. For those left floating, it was a terrible choice. Burn or drown, many chose the latter. By early afternoon, the attack had ended, but the suffering continued. The burning hulks of the transports smoldered through the day and into the night. The ocean glowed faintly from the fires, red and orange reflections flickering like a dying sun. Smoke drifted for miles, visible even from the airfields at Leh. American pilots circling back to assess the damage could hardly believe their eyes. Major Edward Liner wrote in his log, "We didn't need to count ships. You could see them sinking one by one. It looked like the end of the world." By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had left Rabaul, fewer than 100 would ever see land again. Nearly 5,700 were dead or missing, many trapped inside their sinking ships, entombed in the cold darkness below. Japanese submarines arriving after dark found a sea of floating corpses and wreckage. The smell of fuel and death hung heavy. Submarine crews worked silently, pulling aboard the few survivors, eyes wide and vacant. Their radio reports back to Rabaul were terse, almost numbing. Convoy destroyed. Total loss. Survivors minimal. Admiral Masatomi Kimura never recovered from what he witnessed. In his after-action report, written weeks later, he could not describe the battle in tactical terms. Instead, he wrote a single, haunting line: "The sea itself was our enemy." At dawn the next morning, smoke still drifting across the water, a few sailors on the damaged destroyer Yukikaze gathered on deck to pray. One young seaman, Hiroshi Nakata, placed a folded paper crane into the sea. It floated for a moment before catching fire on the oil slick, burning until it disappeared. War had never seemed so absolute, so mechanical, so final. In just 15 minutes, a single innovation, 8 machine guns, and a new bombing technique had wiped out an entire Japanese division and shattered the Navy's faith in its own invincibility. The Pacific would never look the same. When the first news of the Bismarck Sea disaster reached Rabaul, disbelief gave way to stunned silence. Officers read the decoded radio messages twice to be certain. 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost, thousands dead. Admiral Kimura among the few survivors. Mission failed. The scale of destruction was unthinkable. Never before in the Imperial Navy's history had an entire convoy been annihilated in a single daylight attack. It was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of the doctrine that had guided Japanese naval strategy for decades. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Those present later recalled that he read it slowly, expressionless, then placed the papers down and said quietly, "If this is true, then we no longer control the sea." For the commander who had orchestrated the triumph at Pearl Harbor, it was a weight heavier than defeat itself. The empire he had helped build now faced an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. Until that day, Japan's surface fleet had relied on speed, discipline, and firepower. Convoys were shielded by layers of destroyers, their anti-aircraft guns forming what they called the umbrella of steel. For nearly 2 years, it had worked. But the Bismarck Sea shattered that illusion. No umbrella could stop bombs that skipped like stones or machine guns that cut through armor faster than human reflexes could respond. Within days, operational planners convened an emergency session. Charts and maps spread across tables, red circles marking the reach of American aircraft from bases in Australia and New Guinea. The conclusion was devastating. Every major convoy route in the South Pacific now lay within range of B-25 Strafers and their escorting fighters. Daytime resupply was suicide. Even heavily armed destroyers were powerless against aircraft striking at wave height from beyond radar detection. A new order emerged. Surface resupply would now take place only at night. Troop transports were abandoned. Smaller vessels, barges, and submarines attempted to carry food, ammunition, and fuel under cover of darkness. The Japanese called it Yasen Yuso, the night run. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. But whatever the name, it was a desperate improvisation, incapable of replacing the massive convoys that had once carried entire divisions across the Pacific. The consequences rippled far beyond the Bismarck Sea. Without steady resupply, Japanese garrisons on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands began to wither. Soldiers who had fought with discipline and confidence now starved in the jungle. Malaria, hunger, and exhaustion claimed more lives than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships, it was the death of logistics, the end of mobility. Imperial Navy statisticians compiled the numbers. Between March 1943 and the end of 1944, Japan lost over 60% of its merchant fleet, nearly 1,500 vessels, including transports, tankers, freighters, and destroyers. Many fell to the same combination that destroyed Kimura's convoy: low-level strafing attacks and skip bombing runs by B-25s and their variants. What had once been a proud merchant marine became a long list of names and hull numbers lost to history. Survivor reports filtered back over the following weeks. Commanders described panic and near-superstitious fear of American aircraft. Sailors called the B-25 Hachime, the eight-eyed demon, for its glaring eight-barrel nose. Others called it the flying saw, claiming the roar of its guns could slice the air itself. Even seasoned officers admitted that men froze at the first sight of low-flying bombers, courage drowned by memories of the inferno that had consumed their comrades. At the Naval Staff College in Tokyo, analysts struggled to comprehend what had gone wrong. One report concluded bluntly, "Our doctrine assumes the enemy will attack as we would. He does not." For centuries, Japanese military philosophy had prized discipline, hierarchy, and repetition, virtues that had served well in battles of precision and control. The Americans, by contrast, embraced improvisation. They changed tactics overnight, turned bombers into gunships, mechanics into engineers, experiments into victories. Yamamoto admitted privately, this was the purest expression of industrial warfare, the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. For the Americans, the victory confirmed that the future of naval war no longer belonged to battleships or torpedoes. It belonged to machines like the B-25, fast, flexible, deadly, and to the men who dared to reimagine how they were used. The 5th Air Force now wielded a weapon capable of annihilating entire convoys in mere minutes, a weapon that required neither fleets nor complex formations, only courage, ingenuity, and relentless precision. In the months that followed, such attacks became routine. Japanese convoys attempting to run supplies to New Guinea, New Britain, or the Solomons were shredded by Allied aircraft. Reports from survivors repeated the same tale over and over. Sudden appearance, blinding flashes, unending gunfire, and ships exploding within seconds. No amount of bravery, no drill or training could offset the speed and precision of the American onslaught. By late 1943, Admiral Yamamoto's once mighty fleet had been forced into a defensive crouch. Large-scale surface operations nearly ceased. The Imperial Navy, once master of the Pacific, had become a fleet of ghosts, moving only under the cover of night. In his private diaries, recovered after the war, Yamamoto wrote a line shortly after the disaster. "It is not courage we lack, it is time. The enemy learns faster than we can think." In the United States, newspapers barely mentioned the battle. To the home front, it was just another small victory in a distant ocean. But among pilots and mechanics, the Bismarck Sea had achieved legendary status. It proved that improvisation could triumph over doctrine, that a handful of men in a makeshift hangar could alter the course of a war. Pappy Gunn's creation had evolved from an experiment into a symbol of American ingenuity, the embodiment of an industrial giant's ability to think on its feet. The psychological divide between the two sides deepened with every sinking. For Japanese sailors, each voyage became a prayer. For American aircrews, a test of precision and nerve. The Pacific itself seemed transformed into an open battlefield, but a place where one side hunted and the other hid. The old rules of naval warfare, range, tonnage, formation, gunnery, no longer applied. A new law had been written in the smoke of the Bismarck Sea. Whoever could combine innovation with speed would rule the oceans. By early 1944, Japanese commanders no longer planned operations based on courage or numbers, but on absence deploying convoys only where Americans were not. Even then, radar-equipped Allied aircraft often found them. What had begun as a single engagement became a permanent reality. Upon receiving the reports, Yamamoto called his staff together. "We have been defeated not by their weapons," he said, "but by their minds." It is in its simplicity the truth. The empire that stunned the world at Pearl Harbor is now undone by the same innovation it once claimed as its own. The war was no longer about who could build the largest battleship. It was about who could adapt fastest. The Bismarck Sea had proven the age of the battleship was over. In its place arose a new type of warfare: industrial, inventive, relentless. The Americans would carry that lesson forward, turning factories into arsenals and ideas into weapons. For Japan, the sea that had once carried conquest had become a prison of oil, fire, and memory. Years later, when the wrecks of the Bismarck Sea had settled beneath layers of coral and silt, veterans from both sides would speak of that day with the same uneasy reverence. For Americans, it was triumph, a proof that creativity and mechanical genius could overcome doctrine and discipline. For Japanese survivors, it was the day courage and tradition were swallowed by a new kind of war. Yet for everyone who had witnessed it, one truth remained: nothing in war would ever be the same again. The B-25 Strafer had begun as an act of desperation, a field modification born in a dusty hangar with salvaged parts and half-formed ideas. Its success revealed a deeper truth: invention itself was a weapon. The 8 gun barrels jutting from the Mitchell's nose symbolized not just power, but the ability to adapt, to turn necessity into advantage. It was this mindset, not merely firepower, that came to define the American way of war. After the Bismarck Sea, the concept spread. North American aviation began producing factory-built gun modifications. Later variants of the B-25, especially the J-22 model, carried up to 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, flying arsenals capable of leveling convoys or obliterating small towns. Pilots began to think of their aircraft not as bombers, but as hunters. When the 345th Bombardment Group, the Apaches, received their new Strafers, they painted shark mouths across the noses and called them flying battleships. The Pacific skies had become their hunting ground. By late 1943, the B-25 Strafer had redefined Allied air tactics. Squadrons developed new methods for attacking ships, airfields, and coastal defenses. Dawn raids over Rabaul and Wewak could erase entire harbors in minutes. Japanese observers described the sound of approaching aircraft as a rolling drum fire that devoured the air itself. To those under attack, it no longer felt like planes overhead. It was a moving factory of destruction, a symbol of American industrial might made airborne. Yet among the air crews, there was little celebration. Pilots and gunners returned, burdened with what they had seen. Ships exploding, men thrown into flames, the sea turning red. Major Edward Edliner, who led the first wave over the Bismarck Sea, later admitted, "We didn't cheer when we landed. We just sat there. It felt like we'd seen too much." In later years, he would visit museums where B-25s hung silent and gleaming in restoration. "They don't make a sound anymore," he said, "but I still hear it." For Japan, the legacy was equally haunting. The Bismarck Sea had rewritten the rules of war, and the memory of that inferno, a floating graveyard of courage, discipline, and tradition, would linger long after the smoke had cleared. The triumph of the B-25 forced the Imperial Navy into a shadow war of secrecy and survival. Convoys that once sailed boldly under the sun now crept through moonless nights, silent and cautious, threading through waters they had once ruled with confidence. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea became a lesson etched into every naval cadet's education. Underestimate innovation, and tradition becomes a liability. In the post-war years, military engineers around the world studied the concept that Major Pappy Gunn had pioneered: an aircraft transformed into a gun platform, capable of concentrating devastating fire on a single target. 2 decades later, that principle resurfaced in the jungles of Vietnam. There, the U.S. Air Force brought it to life in the AC-47 Spooky gunship, a transport plane armed with side-firing miniguns that rained death in glowing arcs through the night canopy. Its successor, the AC-130 Spectre, carried even greater firepower. Cannons, autocannons, sensors, all echoing the innovation first born at Eagle Farm. Later in the 20th century, the lineage of the Strafer could be seen in the A-10 Thunderbolt Thuruan, the Warthog. Ugly, durable, devastating, like its ancestor. Its GAU-8 Avenger cannon, firing 3,900 rounds per minute, was the modern equivalent of the B-25's 8 guns. The same principle endured, an aircraft designed not merely to deliver weapons, but to become one. Historians often call the B-25 Strafer the most successful field modification in aviation history. But to those who built and flew them, success was never the word they used. They called it survival. For every innovation that altered the course of war, there was a human cost, unmeasurable in statistics. The wrecks of Shirayuki, Nojima Maru, and Kaikusai Maru still lie scattered across the seabed, twisted and silent. Inside some, the remains of soldiers rest, their names long forgotten. In 1969, divers from Papua New Guinea discovered one wreck. A transport split cleanly in half, its steel hull pierced in dozens of places by what at first looked like explosives. Closer examination revealed hundreds of neat, circular holes, each the exact diameter of a .50 caliber bullet. Even after decades underwater, the evidence endured. Today, the sea over those wrecks is calm again. Schools of fish drift through rusted corridors where soldiers once stood. Coral grows over the twisted steel, softening the outlines of destruction. Sunlight filters through the water in golden shafts, touching the guns, the railings, the bones of ships long gone. The surface of the Bismarck Sea is smooth, but beneath it lie the intertwined traces of innovation and tragedy. It is tempting to call the B-25 Strafer a triumph of American ingenuity. And in a sense, it was. It proved that courage and creativity could reshape the battlefield, that a workshop could be as decisive as the front line. But to those who watched entire convoys vanish beneath the waves, the memory carried a harsher truth. Every leap in invention deepens the abyss of destruction. Major Pappy Gunn never lived to see the full impact of his creation. He died in 1957 in a plane crash near the Philippines. On his desk at home, a note written in his hand was found. "We built them fast because men were dying faster." For him, as for so many others, the line between necessity and genius had always been thin. Standing today on the shores of Papua New Guinea, one can still look out over the Bismarck Sea and imagine that morning in 1943, the calm, the smoke, the thunder, and the silence that followed. Somewhere below, among coral and sand, lie the remains of ships and men who witnessed the moment when war itself changed form. The 8 gun barrels that once jutted from the noses of American bombers now rest in museums and memorials, their metal dulled by time, yet still symbols of a truth that transcends nations and victories. In war, the tools that define progress often carry the weight of what they destroy. And as the waves roll gently over the graves of March 3rd, 1943, the sea keeps its secret, a quiet monument to ingenuity, devastation, and the fragile boundary between them.